And, oh, excuse me, 1 second.
Okay, everyone, welcome to Grief, Mourning, Race, and National Memorial, a conversation with the co-editors of Till Death Do Us Part, American Ethnic Cemeteries as Borders Uncrossed, published in May by University Press of Mississippi. If you will, please, if you've just joined, go ahead and mute yourself. It will help if there are any disturbances where you are. In 2020, University Press of Mississippi is celebrating its 50th year of publishing, and we're so glad you could join us for this part of the anniversary celebration. If I may, a little bit of housekeeping. Our moderator will signal us when she is ready to open the floor for questions. There's a chat provided in Zoom, so feel free to start crafting a question there anytime you wish. We'll make sure it gets attention. We are recording this session, and we will make it available at University Press of Mississippi's Vimeo site and also at our YouTube playlist. Let me go ahead and introduce our panelists. Alan Amanek is Assistant Professor in the Department of Judaic Studies, Brooklyn College, CUNY. He specializes in American Jewish history. He is the author of Dust to Dust, A History of Jewish Death and Burial in New York from New York University Press. And he is co-editor of Till Death Do Us Part, published by University Press of Mississippi. Also co-editor of that UPM volume is Cammie Fletcher, Associate Professor of History at Albright College and the President of the Collective for Radical Death Studies. She is the author of Real Business, Maryland's First Black Cemetery Journeys into the Enterprise of Death, 1807 to 1920, and she is working on Grave History, Death and Race in Southern Cemeteries from the Antebellum to the Post-Civil Rights Era, soon under contract with University of Georgia Press. We're especially grateful today to our moderator, Suzanne Eastman. She is Professor of History at the Department of History and Art History at George Mason University. She is the author of Dancing in the Street, Motown, and the Cultural Politics of Detroit from Harvard University Press, and To Serve the Living, Funeral Directors and the African American Way of Death, the Belknap Press of Harvard University Press. Her current book project is The Best Known Colored Man, Race, Religion, and the Rise of Elder Lightfoot Solomon Mishaw. Dr. Smith, thank you so much for being our moderator, and the Zoom is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. Can everyone hear me all right? I just want to make sure my headset's working. Thank you. First, I want to just congratulate Cammie and Alan on the publication of this incredible project. They had been in touch with me even in the very beginnings of the project, and I'm just thrilled to see it out in the world. As a senior scholar in the field of American death studies, I can attest to how groundbreaking this work is in terms of completely reimagining how cemeteries can literally bring life to a multitude of critical histories about how racial minorities and ethnic as well as faith-based communities have used burial practice to assert their humanity and fight for their rights. As Cammie and Alan in the introduction of the book write in the introduction of the book, the powerful essays in this volume teach us how deeper explorations of the complex and often divided terrains of American graveyards have much to tell us about, quote, American identity, nationhood, and national belonging, end quote. The publication of the book, however, has taken on new meaning and even deeper relevance in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic crisis and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement in the past few months. When Alan and Cammie invited me to be a part of this dialogue today, I was honored to be asked and would like to jump in now and just see where this conversation goes. So to begin, I thought it'd be great for everyone tuning in to have each of you just talk about what drew you originally into the field of death studies and what intellectual questions did you think could be answered on the grounds of cemeteries. And I don't have a particular order in with how you respond. You guys can decide.
Ellen, you can go. Sure.
Sure. Yeah, well, thanks everyone first for zooming in. I know we're all a little zoomed out by now. I think, thinking about maybe how I got to death studies, there's probably the personal piece of it, and then I think you phrased it in a good way. What are the intellectual questions or insights that we can get from that? I think very quickly in terms of the personal, I grew up in a family, in a community overwhelmingly made up of Holocaust survivors. So, whether they realized it or not, whether they consciously acted on it or not, death and loss were just present and kind of shaping everything. From school curricula to politics, family life, religious observances, memorialization regularly. So I think in some ways, maybe I was predisposed to kind of think about death or to notice it in the archives. And so, maybe it's not surprising. I go on to study American history, immigration. And when I was working on the first book, I sort of thought, I went into it thinking I was going to do some study of 19th century Jewish immigrant societies, mutual aid societies. But the thing that sort of struck me, and then also the further back in time that I went, was just how central planning for end of life, purchasing cemeteries, funeral provisions, sort of were as an engine of social life, social systems. And so, in a way, that kind of reciprocity, I think, is one of the maybe intriguing things or driving things. So that's maybe a quick sort of answer.
That's great. Thanks. Cammie.
Yeah, doing my graduate work, getting my PhD at Morgan, I saw myself continuing and studying Black social movements and digging more into the Black women's experience and feminism. But my graduate advisor told me about an opportunity to help restore and preserve Mount Auburn Cemetery in Baltimore. And they were looking for a graduate student to just kind of look at ways, how do you restore this historical cemetery that they thought was founded in 1872, and it was paying. And as a graduate student, I said, yeah, let me give it a shot. Yeah. But being from Arkansas, you didn't play with death. You don't go to cemeteries unless you know people that are buried there. You don't go walking around looking at cemeteries. You're not honoring the dead doing that. That's how I was raised. That's how I was taught. But immediately going in there and learning that this was, for my own research, that this cemetery actually went back to 1807, that this was on the National Register of Historic Places. I was just immediately I bought into this as being historically significant, and this story needed to be told. And so as someone getting a PhD in history, just looking at archives and trying to learn about the experience of Africans in this country, that was yet the lens that I was going to look through. I was going to look at cemeteries. I was going to look at death and deathways. And so, yeah, that idea of an intellectual question prior to 1865, when African Americans or Black folks were just seen as someone's slave or wench or what have you, in the cemetery, that's where their humanity was. That's where you could see names and, the records of who these people were. And so that's pretty much my foray into it.
Great, that's wonderful. And I also think, especially as you said, in African American history, like a lot of the best records for genealogists are in the death records for people who study the history of slavery or after slavery. So it's so true as a primary source. It's amazing. I'm going to kind of meld together a couple questions I have here, but one of them is in the introduction, or the subtitle of your book is American Ethnic Cemeteries as Borders Uncrossed. And in the introductory essay, you really talk about how the concept of borders shaped the whole project. And I just wanted you maybe to ease into like both talking about the book and talking about contemporary situations right now, what that concept of borders meant to you at the beginning and how it feels right now in the middle of the book launch, in the middle of all these crises. Maybe Cammie, you can start with this one.
Sure. As we say in the intro, this project was born out of the Organization of American Historians, their conference that year in 2014. And Alan reached out to me and others about being part of this panel. And that question and putting that term right up front, borders, we don't think about death in this way. This is what we say, death is the great equalizer. Everybody dies, you can't take it with you. But what, him and I having those kind of initial back and forth conversations was these Black folks didn't want to be buried with white folks. And he was talking about, that he'll talk about later, from the Jewish perspective. And I think for us, it was, wow, we know that cemeteries border communities. We know that geographically they're spaced off from the living, but there's more going on here. There are borders of race and gender and class that's going on inside the community. And one of the first things that I saw was, especially when you're talking about slave cemeteries, that so many people have just taken for granted. And that was the thing that we grapple with, this idea of segregating your dead. No one talked about that. Like, that's just what you do. And in your work, Suzanne, to serve the living and just going to a Black funeral director, you're not going to go to this white person. Why? Yeah. So we're asking, this question. And so when you look back, because this centers on the 19th century, kind of going in the early 20th century. And when you look back at this work, you have this idea that Black folks are not humans in life. You cannot then give anybody, you're not going to care if they die. You're not going to care anything about their rituals and these types of things. So this type of cemetery work that I saw, I just saw them screaming this was burial rights. Mm-hmm. And when we think about land and what land means, having that little square of land, and then how they went on to use it. There were people in the community that were building businesses off of this. There was much more going on. And so I look at now, to your question here now, African-American last rites rituals are on full display. I don't know anyone that did not see George Floyd's funeral and what that meant. That gold casket was the centerpiece. You tried to caricature him as a thug, as a nobody whose life was snuffed out in death. That gold casket, his family, he's been connected back to his family. This was a person. People missed him. People loved him. This is who he was. His mother was this, right? So you have this whole, kinship pattern develop. You are challenging stereotypes about the Black community, and giving this humanity. And it's this kind of full scale spectrum of me looking at the cemetery with burial rights and then looking at, George Floyd with human rights that led to this international protest.
Exactly. That's so true. Alan, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, maybe to take like the second part of your question too, one thing that's been very interesting for me is kind of how the project has evolved over the last few years, the meaning around it as we've been working on it.
Yeah.
As Cammie mentioned, in the beginning, it was sort of, I guess, kind of a product of just generally kind of thinking about borders thematically, symbolically in American history. And, I think we were just sort of approaching it from like a basic question. This is kind of a norm, ethnic, religious, racial groups separate in death. Nobody really questions it.
Right.
You know, in a way, it was sort of a benign question. I think over time, and I think in particular, as just the political climate has just become so divisive, so painfully divisive, you know, thinking about borders and divisions in American society and American history, and especially centering some of that around death and the ways it intersects with race. You know, it's just taken on such a different meaning. I think maybe, you know, towards how it's taken shape, I think maybe some of the prejudices or social hierarchies that are underwriting some of the reasons why different groups are separating, you know, come out a bit more. But maybe one thing too that strikes me in some of the chapters is some of the power, some of the agency that different groups are able to claim or reclaim by varying apart. You know, I think you characterize it really well in the introductory remarks, the ways in which some of the different communities in the different chapters can assert their humanity. So it's, yeah, it's just striking to me, like the meaning, the resonance, right, over the course of the book's evolution.
Yeah, if I can jump into the conversation, because I really appreciate what Cammie was saying and to kind of build on what you were saying. And I love Cammie's emphasis on George Floyd's gold casket and the symbolism of that, the power of that in the African-American homegoing tradition. And when I think about my own scholarship, I think a lot about the moment when Jessica Mitford first really started criticizing the funeral industry in the early 60s with her book, The American Way of Death, and how at the time, which leads to, of course, as we know, the government investigating the whole funeral industry, and the African-American funeral directors respond very differently than the white funeral directors. Like white funeral directors were, you know, defensive and, you know, scared and, you know, really responded very differently, where African-American funeral directors looked at all this criticism and said, basically, screw you, if I can say that. Like they said, and I'm kind of almost paraphrasing what Cammie just said, which is, you know, George Floyd was basically lynched, right? So they're saying, when our people are lynched and white people just leave them on the street or on the funeral or on the pyre of flame, we're the ones who come in and bury them. And we will bury them with pageantry, and we will not be criticized for doing that because it's their humanity. And I remember when I researched that, feeling the power of that, you know, that fight and that dignity. And I think, like I said, Cammie captured it beautifully in her characterization of what that funeral meant, the George Floyd funeral meant recently. Now, to kind of maybe build on another question I had, I'm kind of jumping around in the questions I wrote up, but this I think really feeds into what we're talking about. And this is something, I'm just going to speak personally. My husband and I have been talking a lot about this just in our own family, which is that as of this week, 128,000 Americans have died from this pandemic. It's staggering. I know personal friends of mine have died, colleagues of mine have died. Like I know people who've died of this virus personally. So I'm going to try to hold it in right now about that. But I just feel like nobody, well, obviously with our current administration in the White House, but nobody's making any effort to like find a way to collectively as a nation mourn these losses. And a question I want you all, both of you, to think about or respond to is like, is there a way we can collectively grieve these losses, do you think, as a nation? Because I think nationhood is such a part of your scholarship in this book. Or is it really back to what Alan was just saying? We're so politically divided and we're divided into our different ethnic, racial, immigrant communities and we're so lost in so much grief that we just can't come together as a country and find a way to mourn this in any symbolic way. And maybe we don't need to. I don't know. I'm just really opening it up as somebody who's struggling with this grief a lot personally. And I'm going to try not to get emotional, but Cammie, what do you think?
No, I mean, I think we should get emotional. You know, and that's the thing. Miclier, you know, her wonderful book, the title escapes me now, but she did this op-ed for the New York Times or the Washington Post. Why aren't we grieving? Right? Why isn't there national mourning? And my response to that, and I have told people, is that the narrative has been hijacked. The narrative has been steeped in xenophobia. It's a Chinese disease. Right. We're at war. The leadership will not wear a mask. This is a liberal hoax. And when all of the things that we're talking about with race is that when you look at the people that are dying, these Black and brown people who are dying, it goes back to not caring. When the Surgeon General gets on TV and says, well, lay off the alcohol and tobacco.
What are we talking about?
How do these people are doing it to themselves? It's pathology. So, you know, looking at Alan and our, you know, our book, you have to look at how American identity has been constructed. And for the African American community, we can acculturate all we want in death, right? And this is what you're saying, Suzanne, is that we picked up this material culture and used it to fight back against Jim Crow.
Right.
No, I'm not your maid. I'm actually all of this, an imitation of life with Annie. You know, I use that example a lot. And we've just rejected a lot of it. And we talk about that in the book, these different, you know, racial groups rejecting an identity that nobody wanted us, you know, to be a part of. But I think that's it. I think we absolutely can heal. Don Jerelliman wrote a really, I think, important article in Mortality about 3 or 5 years ago. And it was this idea of therapeutic memorials, right? Looking at maybe the massacre of Wounded Knee, September 11th, right? And building monuments. And I reached out to him because he's a personal friend of mine. And I said, in this moment of Southern memorials being torn down, that's my therapy. Seeing them come down. Maybe we don't need to, you know, build something, but seeing all this divisiveness and this hate that's put up in the name of being an American, seeing that, you know, come down and people rallying around that, saying, no, that's not who we are. Let's build something new. That's where I'm seeing the unity.
Which is, really interesting, right? That it's the confluence actually of the Black Lives Matter movement hitting the pandemic that's giving you some place to like at least process some of your feelings and feel some way that catharsis to work through some of it, I guess. Yeah. Alan, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I don't know, I guess the first part of your question, you know, are we capable of national grieving? You know, it strikes me in a period where like the deaths themselves, the statistics themselves are so politicized. Is that a possibility? I don't know, but you know, I've been sort of collecting, I guess, since a month ago, when Cami and I were first talking about maybe doing this, and Cami, you know, sort of put out the idea of grieving. Are we not? What does it look like? And so I just I had my little like scrapbook of news items. I don't know if I can share my screen. Can I share my screen? Is that a thing?
That'd be great.
It says it's been disabled.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, I think it has to be the host to do that. If you've got a file that you could shoot to me an email real quick, we could really do some daring do and make it happen.
Yeah, maybe I can try and talk and send at the same time. One thing that, you know, sort of struck me, I don't know, it just struck me as a very interesting expression of a lot of this. So there's like a 20,000 square foot mural that was painted in Corona Park in Queens of a physician, I think a pediatrician, Dr. Ildefonso Deku. And, you know, basically the backstory was a 70-year-old immigrant doctor who died tending to patients of coronavirus. And ultimately, the mural was commissioned to him. Maybe I'll try and send it to Steve. We can take a look if that's possible. But, sort of the idea behind it, I was, then watching like some interviews with the artist. He was sort of saying, his aim was to give folks a place to go, to mourn, to process, to grieve, to create a space. Also to kind of highlight the role of immigrant healthcare workers on the front lines. And, also to kind of underscore the racial disparities in terms of, communities that are being affected by the virus. And, I don't know, it's temporary, paint washes away, but it sort of struck me maybe as, I don't know, an interesting example maybe to think about. And it was resonating in an interesting way too. I think particularly, the spirit of inclusivity and some of the racial justice issues are kind of combating social equality, right, that are sort of just kind of symbolically wrapped up in there. I don't know, and I think it's something that, we're maybe hungering for, like particularly at this confluence of just so much unprocessed loss, whether it's virus or death at the hands of police brutality. I don't know, that's, I guess, something that I've been sort of thinking about.
A great point, Alan, which is, at least that's what I feel is, and maybe this is also connecting to things Cami has said, like, at this point, I don't know about the rest of you or all the people listening right now. I just feel like I can't even sort it out anymore. Like everything is kind of melding together. Like my feelings about George Floyd versus, how I also see these numbers ticking up every day and knowing people are dying every day. Like it's a lot of unprocessed loss. And I guess like as a I struggle with as a person, just not a scholar or anything, is like, sometimes I just don't know how in my day-to-day life, how to process. Cause I guess I'm a very sensitive human being who like feels other people's loss very acutely. So I just feel like it's hard for me right now to process it all every day emotionally. I take in a lot just in some kind of psychic way. But I would also say that, I think it was Cami who first brought up 9/11. Like I think, and I really liked Cami's thoughts about how the narrative's been hijacked, right? So that we're not in any mode right now, at least from the top of our government, to see this as something that everyone in this country should come together and mourn for because of the demographics of who are dying, because of the racism that's the White House is spewing about how the virus got started. And I really, I think what Alan just said too, is like, I think right now, all we're going to see is the grassroots, like grassroots memorials coming from within these communities, which I think just affirms your book theories, right? Your argument of your book, right? That people who are most immediately affected by these things are going to find their own ways to do it in their own separate places. And maybe that's how it just has to be. And that's the answer to the original question I asked. But I think it's just, for me, upsetting for how it feels, where the country is as a whole. I think that's really hard. Now I'm almost running out of time for my questions, but I'm going to throw one more in just because I'm going to be selfish, which is, I had this one question, which I hope you thought was somewhat interesting, which is in light of the George Floyd, the resurgence of Black Lives Matter after the George Floyd murder, there's all the rushes, Cami said, of pulling down these monuments, most notably the Confederate ones, but now, lots of other ones. And some people have argued they should go to cemeteries. And I just wanted to get your take on that, right? That we don't just get rid of them, but we just put them to a cemetery. So if Cami, you can take this one first, but like, what does that mean to you as somebody who's studied this so deeply to say, okay, I guess a cemetery can be a museum to white supremacy, your thoughts. So, but this is like a...
No, and I'm glad that you asked me first because my new volume, honestly, of course, no disrespect to Alan at all, but my new volume, it is under contract with University of Georgia Press, was spurned out of this idea.
Oh, was it really? Yeah.
It was spurned out of this idea. Ashley told, she's at Maine. Her and I were on a panel similar to kind of how Alan and I got started in this one. And it was just like, but they're in cemeteries. Like, but that's the discussion is, it centers on cemeteries. Which and this is the one thing I really want to start with, is that cemeteries are a sacred space. This is what I want people to understand. I understand that these monuments are smack dab in the middle of City Hall. You have schools named after Jefferson Davis. Like, I understand. But cemetery, you don't speak ill of the dead. You don't walk over the dead, right? So
Right.
how then, and this is what we're honestly trying to explore in this volume, is that how do you go from having whole sections, right, of looking at the ladies memorial associations, having whole sections dedicated to Confederate soldiers, to then having these monuments up in sacred spaces where you have Ida B. Wells, who led an international lynching campaign, and on the other side is a Confederate section. You know, how do you make sense of that? And this is what Suzanne, this is what Alan, this is what all of us are saying. Our nation is finally at the point of almost explosion, because you cannot make sense, you know, of the two. The other thing I just wanted to point out is that if you look at when these monuments and things have gone up, it hasn't been in 1865 when slavery was over. Like, that's what a lot of people think, or 1840, whatever, when slavery was still ongoing. But many of these things are due to the height of Jim Crow, right? 1930s, when these points are erected. And in my own research on Jim Crow cemeteries, seeing cemeteries in Iowa and California, and I'm still plotting these places. It's like, does Jim Crow then have bounds? Are we talking about legally? Are we talking about the idea of the separation? Because Chicago became a real hotbed with Oak Burr. I think I'm getting the name wrong.
Oak Burr. No,
Oak
that's
Burr.
right. I think that's right. Yeah.
You know, it's a real hotbed. So I'm hoping we can dig even more, you know, in this volume, in exploring this, and the communities, right? The communities of the living that formed around these cemeteries.
Yeah. Alan, your thoughts?
I mean, I think Cami expressed it very well. I don't really understand the logic. I don't understand the logic of, you know, moving these statues to cemeteries. And, you know, I mean, you even think about like the meaning of erecting them, right, in public spaces. Such prominent view. What's the hierarchy that they were intended to reinforce? What's the threat, right, that they were intended to impose? You know, then do you kind of take that context and take that that power that they may have had, and, you know, maybe to build on Cami's metaphor of like the cemetery is the holy ground. Do you contaminate that space then, right? I don't know.
The other thing I'd throw in here, which I think is important to the conversation, and I'm excited to open up the floor to everyone else, but I think that the other way to think about this, right, is also how you add memorials to the public square to lynching, which is, you know, they've tried to do with Emmett Till and others. And as many of you know, the memorials to Emmett Till have been bullet ridden. You know, people come and shoot them up. So there's that problem. And then there's the other, I mean, the other in between like putting up counter memorials in the public square to lynching, which is one thing to do, or as other scholars are saying right now, just keep up some of these monuments, but contextualize them with extra plaques, you know, so that people can come up and know that it's contested space, which I don't know really. I'm not sure if I've gotten off the fence on that one, but there's like other ways negotiation can happen where we don't just relegate things to cemeteries, but none of it feels that good. And I think I'd go back to what Cami said earlier, I think, which is maybe we should just rip down all these monuments everywhere and just be done. Just be done. I don't know. That's my thought. But I think maybe we should open the floor to the rest of people listening. And I don't know if Steve, how you want to do that now, if you can see who's
I
raising their
do. I
hand?
can see everyone who's sharing their video. And so if you will quite literally wave a hand at me, I can unmute you and you can get started on the question. But also I encourage you to use the chat. In fact, we've already got a question in chat from Karen. And she asks this: given the connection between genealogy research and death records, how do the unmarked graves in slave cemeteries and the renaming of slaves challenge the idea of connecting to one's ancestors in the Black community? Are there researchers trying to discover the identities of people buried in slave cemeteries?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll take that, and I'm happy for Suzanne Allen to jump in as well. I was excited to be invited on a public history project with Mount Harmon Plantation in Cecil County, so I've done some of that work myself. Lynn Rainville is an expert scholar, hidden history in Virginia. I mean, she has done phenomenal work. So please go get her book. And then there's another book that comes to mind, Loving Cemetery, about a slave cemetery in Texas. But the one thing that I want to say about that is I think that our society, I don't think that most Americans understand that this is still private property. And so what Loving Cemetery does, and there was a dig that the University of Maryland did where Frederick Douglass was enslaved in Talbot County. And this property has remained private property in white folks' families, these slaveholders. And so I say that for emphasis because even trying to get at Black history right now in 2020 is still that white supremacist kind of framework. I'm not saying that these white folks are white supremacists themselves, but that's still a border. I can't just go to a public space and then just go and see my folks. Also, there's something that scholars that's really doing this work called the slave landscape, where these were spaces that were near the slave quarters, that was near rivers, and they were hidden spaces that really weren't supposed to be found. Because if you look at these records, many of the slaveholders inserted themselves in death in ways that Black people did not want them to. This idea of wanting Black people buried with them in slave cemeteries. My favorite slave is being buried with me. One scholar calls this spiritual contamination. If you read through these records, they thought these people were evil in life. And if you've read any account or seen 12 Years a Slave, you can see this to be true. But it's hard. It's so difficult. And even in the project that I'm doing, trying to find the people that are buried there for a number of reasons. And then don't even get into this transient nature of, definitely in Baltimore, this idea of hiring out. So you could be on this plantation in Cecil County, but being hired out in Baltimore to be a caulker, working on the ships. But there's absolutely people doing this work. It's just very challenging.
Yeah, if I could just jump in for a second. One thing I would say to just add to what Cami knows, which her knowledge is more extensive than mine on this particular question, but I actually have a former undergraduate student of mine at George Mason worked at the Fairfax County Circuit Courthouse Historic Records as an intern. And she launched the first slave index in the country, as far as I know, where she sat there for a whole year and went through the court records of Fairfax County and started indexing all the slave names to try to help genealogists with this work, and created a digital database. And so that wouldn't necessarily help you to know where people were buried per se, but it's, this kind of work I think that genealogists are trying to figure out for themselves within African-American families. And I think, and the other quick point I wanted to say, which I'm glad Cami brought it up, which is that in my work on Elder Mishaw, which he was an African-American from here in Virginia, in my research, I actually went to and interviewed the descendants of the original Mishaw family who enslaved his family. And they have a whole, plantation down in Virginia, and they took me to their family graveyard. And while they were walking me through their family graveyard, they whispered to me, "Oh, well, the slaves were buried here, but don't tell anyone." and I think it was because I was white that they were just going to tell me this is some big secret. But it was very much to what Cami was saying. Like it gave me this whole different understanding of what Cami was describing, of like how these white slaveholders would bury their slaves in their own family graveyards, and how any African American would then know how to find their their ancestors through that would be very difficult because these white people are trying to hide it. Another question on the chat, or?
There was a lovely comment here from Tim Mornett, and I'm sure some of you have seen this too. This goes in reference to the collective grieving that we're not really being permitted in the country with COVID-19 raging, and he mentioned that the PBS NewsHour every Friday evening features people who have died from the pandemic, and that's helped him grieve, he says, what otherwise might be faceless statistics.
Thanks, that's great to know. I didn't know they were doing that. It's very powerful. Other questions? There's a hand. Steve, can you unmute?
Hi. First, thanks, Cami and Alan, for this event. This is really interesting. And I kind of had a question to build off of what you were saying, Cami, because I knew of a case. I talked to a professor once who was working on some explorations of the enslaved cemetery at Madison's Montpelier in Virginia. And that's an instance where they actually did have access to and relationships with descendants of the people who had been enslaved by the Madison family. And there's this question about whether or not the graves should be disturbed, like whether the bodies needed to be disinterred. And it was really interesting to me at the time that, you know, the family was very clear. They said, we don't want those bodies disturbed. We would rather have it just sort of left alone and not even necessarily kind of marked and turned into this big interpretive center. They wanted to kind of, as you said, kind of keep it as the sacred ground. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to some of those sort of variations, I guess, and how folks maybe want some of these sacred grounds to be marked or not marked, whether maybe the archaeological impulse that some universities have to like dig up and explore the cemetery is in some ways maybe counterintuitive to what they're actually trying to accomplish, which is to honor the people buried there. I don't know if that's a very common kind of problem that happens when we do find some of these cemeteries that aren't necessarily on private ground, where people I think want to do what they think the right thing is, but then there's this question of what is the right thing to do.
Yeah, the ethics of it all. I'm sure Suzanne and Alan can speak to this as well. I know in Lynn and following her work, her book, and then her other articles, she does not dig. You know, you can do GPR work, but I think that's something when you look at the field, the American field of archaeology, and how Native American burial sites were just dug up, put on the pages of National Geographic and, you know, put in museums. Like, that's something that needs to be reckoned with. You know, this idea of you can just do this. This is sacred. Would you want to see your descendants, like this? And I think so much of what you're speaking to, Vicki, is just respect and honor. And what do we respect in this country? So much so that there's a bill. I don't think it's been passed yet, but some of you may know about, there's a bill to preserve African-American slave cemeteries because of this lack of respect. And even historical, cemeteries in the early 20th century, when urbanization happened and just building highways and communities, right? Just right on top, right on top of this. But in thinking about the descendant community, and I'm familiar with what's going on at that particular plantation, so much so there was a whole meeting of scholars and activists and people that were doing this work there, and they have this guide, on how to do this. these spaces have not been welcoming to people of color, even though they existed because of the exploited labor of Black folks. Like that's what I'm saying. There's so much of a reckoning with slavery that we have to have in this country. And I say that because many times the descendant community is just completely ignored. Right? You could have the same last name, you could have the records, you could know this, but the descendant community is just completely, ignored. So I'm not surprised that we have to dig, we have to put these bones up. And I think I would ask myself this, like, why do you need to dig the bones? If you're going on what happened with the African burial ground in New York, they were already digging. Bones were already being come up. That's why I think they continue that, not to just dig down in undisturbed land. But I don't know if I have the answers. I know others that's done this work, but I love that we're having this conversation that's just boils down to, respect and honoring. And we do that for certain communities, then why don't we do it for others?
I see another hand, Steve.
Was it me?
Yes.
My hand?
Yes.
Hi. So this is a question to Alan, and obviously I'm exceedingly biased source here as his dissertation advisor and sort of admirer for a very long time now. But thinking about this particular conversation, the last couple interventions here, can you say anything about how American Jewish cemeteries have handled Holocaust victims who obviously had no bodies? I mean, they were burnt, but yet communities around the United States did set aside spaces in Jewish cemeteries to mark, to put up markers and memorials to family and friends, and more generally to victims of the Holocaust. And what kind of iconography, what kind of politics were there behind those? Again, there's nobody to bury, and yet the sense that it has to be in a memorial has to be in a cemetery. More important to have a memorial in a cemetery, as they saw it, than having something on the public square. Okay, and Holocaust memorials are much, much, much later than those cemetery memorials.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's not really an issue that I've looked at, so I don't know that I can make sort of an informed statement on it, but I mean, it seems like the inverse in a way, right? The instinct is for commemoration, which, I mean, I guess on some level, right, that's part of why this question of genealogy or kind of digging up remains is so fraught, because there is the drive to try and honor, to try and undo some of that erasure of that history. But, then what are sort of the moral dimensions, right, of actually seeing it through? Not really the same issues.
Sure.
But I mean, you've written the book on commemoration, so are there debates? Are there issues? I don't know.
Okay, so
Yeah, if I could piggyback on that, I hear your advisor talking about bodyless memorials. Candy Can in Virtual Afterlives has a wonderful discussion on that that it's lended itself to my own work here, and you speaking about the burnings and the lynchings. In many cases, Black folks didn't get those bodies back, right? You're definitely talking about during slavery and even during now. And with my own research with the RIP t-shirt, it's absolutely a way to combat that. It's absolutely a way to memorialize. I see them as walking memorials, that mainstream society sees this as deviant culture. Why are you walking around with a dead person on a t-shirt? On so many levels, and I'm really trying to unpack this, on so many levels it's wrong. You don't honor a dead person by being on a t-shirt. Are you actively mourning? You know, what is this? You know, but it is in lieu of not having the money to build these brick and mortar or these, I guess I should say copper and cement structures. I can then have this place where I can mourn that society, you know, has written off. Or we think about the ghost bikes, you know, or we think about these, we're in an age of digital mourning. So I think there's definitely something, and people are talking about it. They're talking about using digital space, Zoom funerals and using avatars. It was so interesting to see that on World of Warcraft or a video game, one of their own, this gamer had died, and they had a virtual funeral in the game. And so, you know, talk about a bodyless memorial.
Yeah.
I've got a question, Suzanne, from the chat. It's from Algerie Wilson. And she asks, what are your thoughts on the digging up of a massacre gravesite or a large gravesite in which there are many, many bodies to try to identify people who were part of a tragic loss?
Cami, do you have thoughts about that?
Digging up a massacre. Wow.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in there real quick. That was something that I saw on one of the news where they were talking to some of the people that were looking into this. And that's what I was trying to figure out, why they would even try to have so many years dig these up to try to put names to using DNA, for instance, and things of this sort. So that's what I was just curious if you had an opportunity to look at that as you progress with your studies and writings.
Yeah, did they talk about giving them a proper burial then, you know, with some type of headstone and this, you know, individual burial plots?
Possibly doing like an unknown soldier type, you know, marker, because there's so many that, in my mind, there's too many. So that's what the person brought up, maybe an unknown marker for all the many, because, you know, right now they're saying, for the one in Tulsa, they said there was supposed to be 300, but no one really knows the true count of how many people were actually lost in that massacre.
Right.
Yeah, I was, and when you said massacre, my mind immediately went there. And I was surprised that people did not know about this, you know, that it's embedded in many Black towns that formed pre and post, but mostly post emancipation, you know, Black folks starting a church, having a community, having a cemetery, having a news organ. But people are still surprised, I'm sure. And I would encourage you to look at MOVE, MOVE. It's not an acronym, in Philadelphia. Again, you know, out of the Black Power ideology, these group of folks took the last name African, and due to some of their unorthodox ideas, this idea that they believed in animal rights so much that vermin, that we consider vermin, you know, were animals to them, and being a part of that community. But my point is that they were just bombed in 1985. This men, women, children were literally bombed, you know, by the city. And was it 12? I think it was 12 of them. And the rest were incarcerated earlier with a shootout in 1972. But this idea, again, of just life that you can snuff out, and how do you memorialize this? I think that's the question. You know, do in memorializing this, you don't forget, and then you contextualize the racism, the white privilege, you know, the inhumanity of it all. So I think that's something to absolutely think about, and I appreciate you bringing that up.
And the only other thing I'd say, to jump in for just a second, which we haven't really touched on at all today, is Native Americans and the whole history that the back to massacres, right? That the remains of Native Americans were stolen and taken and sold to museums and all kinds of things that so many scholars who work in that field have done amazing research on. And I think it's something to think about in the context of your question, because I think it's not easy to know what to do if you actually are able to find the remains of people who've been, murdered in a massacre, let alone identify them. But it's a great question.
There's another question from chat, Suzanne. This is from Tim Wernett. He himself is interested in having a green burial, and he wondered if there's a relationship between new burial practices such as this and race, ethnic, and social change, if new practices such as this have a relationship to that.
I'll open that up to Alan and Cammie.
Yeah, the green burial movement, this idea of not having a coffin, right? Maybe having a burial shroud and it being, the small footprint, right? I'm going to live green in life. I'm going to live green in death. It bumps fiercely up against the death industry, right? And that's that Jessica Mitford idea that, Suzanne was pointing out earlier, because you have to then have a green burial, like a cemetery, that's going to allow you to not have a coffin, right? And not to be then, cremated, but just have a body and a shroud. And that conversation intersects itself with SCI, that the American cemetery superintendents, when they really organized, was it 1868, after this rural garden cemetery, where it's not about the burial rights of the lot holder anymore, right? You can't just have a gate and do what you want to do and have all these life-size monuments, but it's now about how the cemetery superintendents want to then organize the cemetery the best it can be. I actually think it's a wonderful idea. I've seen these kind of biodegradable urns, but I think that's that activism that you have, death positive groups, green burial groups that are on the ground advocating for laws, the National Home Funeral Alliance, right? That's doing this work. I'd like to see more. I really would.
Okay, there's another question from chat, and that's how do cremations affect the way we grieve and mourn the dead? Some want their ashes spread in nature where there could be no markers.
Do you see that present day, Alan, in Jewish burials, this idea of cremation?
Cremation? Yeah, certainly. It's not, it's not the most common thing, but even as early as the 20s, you do see Jewish undertakers offering cremation services. And, maybe another thing just around this idea of like green burial or bumping up against the funeral industry. I feel like it's my turn to invoke Jessica Mitford. But, it was interesting to kind of hear the perspective earlier from what I saw in some of my research. There tended to be a split between Jewish undertakers and some of the rabbinical or kind of Jewish religious national organizations. Interestingly, kind of across the spectrum, from observant to reform, kind of agreeing with Mitford, wanting to get back to a certain simplicity that they understood Jewish law, Jewish ritual, to be all about, that they felt some of the commercialism or some of the excess had kind of undercut. So, into the 70s, you get sort of an interesting renewal movement of like grassroots, young suburban American Jews kind of moving back towards ritual burial societies, right, as a way of kind of like sidestepping undertakers. So, not totally green burial, but kind of in some of that same fashion.
Yeah, one thing I would jump in just because of the funny coincidence that I'm doing this from my office where I'm near my shelf of books of death study books. If anyone is more interested in the history of cremation, I highly recommend Purified by Fire by Stephen Prothero. It's a history of cremation in America. So Purified by Fire, it's a great book. Like I said, I happen to just be able to reach for it, but it really gives an incredible history of this, story of cremation in the United States. So I don't know how much time we have left, Steve. Hello?
I'm here. I think we're right at 1 hour, and I don't see any more questions, and I don't believe I've got anybody waving at us. So this is, if there are some concluding remarks or whatever you want to take it, Suzanne, you can.
Yeah, well, I just want to again thank Cammie and Alan for inviting me. I was really honored that they wanted to include me in this conversation, and I have such respect for both of their work and the work they did to bring all these other scholars together in this book. So I'm just really, really honored to be here, and I really have gotten a lot out of this conversation. Like I said, I'm someone who's struggling emotionally right now with all the loss going on, and just talking to everyone today has been really helpful to me personally. And I really feel like this kind of dialogue is what's going to keep us going right now. And I'm going to just give Cammie and Alan also a chance to say their final remarks. But I appreciate everyone coming today and coming with such openness. Cammie, do you want to go?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Grieving openly, that emotive, expressive grieving is something traditional to African Americans. And if this is a space that has been a grieving space, because nationally, we're not, take it. Absolutely, take it. Our book, someone had asked, Till Death Do Us Part, American, yeah, he has it right there. American ethnic, wait, say it, Alan, Lord, Till Death Do Us Part.
Till Death Do Us Part, American Ethnic Cemeteries as Borders Uncrossed.
Thank you, yes. And so we look at, we look at groups, right? And I think that's the thing that I just want to leave with, is that it's not that we're separated culturally, just in talking about this moment now, but our death ways and how we process death and how we ritualize has come from that culture, right? And so if we're talking about Jewish Americans who are not seen as Americans, then anything that this group is doing is going to be seen as counter that. And so we look at Polish groups, we look at Arab and Muslim groups, of course, we look at, African Americans, and I think that's the thing. Some type of way, death has been divorced of culture. And I think that's the thing. We have to then get back to respecting people's cultures. My sons are fluent in Spanish. How do you be fluent in Spanish? Or I watch the cooking channel. How are you fluent in Southwestern spices or soul food, and then not respect the culture from which it comes? People love popular music. How do you then not respect Black culture that created that?
Right.
How do you not? That's what I'm saying. How can you love that and not respect that culture? And that's why I see death ways as it can be a bridge. I really do. I think it can do that, but we first have to see those divisions, and then, start mending.
Yeah. Alan?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just sort of echo, what you've both sort of said about maybe using this space as like a small platform for processing, for grieving. And, as Cammie was describing the book, was sort of thinking back to something that I wrote kind of in the preface or the acknowledgements. One of the things that was very compelling to me about this project was, not just looking at all of these different groups, different immigrant groups, different racial groups, different faith-based groups, and some of the ways that they all separated in death, but you know, the kind of universal or very similar trends or inclinations that many of these chapters also gesture to, that you can kind of thread together. And I think in addition to, you know, maybe grieving with the situation that we're in now, I sort of wrote in the beginning of the book, you know, in a moment when the country is so divided, I hope that some of the commonality across the different cemetery spaces, you know, might also be some path towards healing, recognizing ourselves and others. I think that's just very important, very needed now. So
that's a great thought to end on, Alan. And so like I said, as I guess the moderator, I'd just like to thank everyone for coming, for the lovely questions, for thoughtful listening. And I encourage all of you to rush and buy the book and keep in touch with Cami and Alan through their email accounts or their university email. I don't know if we're including that somehow, but I hope this book gets read far and wide. So thank you all so much.
Suzanne, thank you. This has been wonderful, everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks for being part of our 50th anniversary.
Yeah.
Thank you.
thanks.